had a bug infestation, all, specific key things, right? And then as you collect this data in your notebook, you can then flip through, say today's date is May 5th, and I can look back at the week before and the week after May 5th from previous years. So you won't have that right away, but you accumulate that. It's really useful to have. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the climate challenges that we face, because that's the knowing our climate, knowing the weather that we can expect. That's the next slide, please. Is really important. So, for example, because we live in a rainforest, we get torrential rain in the cold season. We get drought in the growing season, right? So that pounding rain can really compact the soil. You need to keep the soil covered and protected during the winter. And you also don't want to add nutrients in the fall, because likely a lot of it will wash away. So if you add your nutrients, whatever supplements you're adding, just before you're planting, or if you're replanting, add a little bit more compost or more nutrient. That's the best. You want to keep as much nutrient in the garden and not let it run off and pollute the waterways. So all your amendments in the spring before planting. The other thing is the dry season. Because we chronically have summer drought, it's really important that we protect our plants from wind in the dry season, because drought stress is aggravated by hot, dry winds. And you can use shade cloth or old curtain shears. Shade cloth's expensive, old curtain shears are pretty cheap. The difference is you can put the shade cloth up permanently, and the curtain shears have to be removed. So you put them out, when the sun comes around and is intense until the mid-afternoon, and it passes, and then you have to remove them. The Remay is not shade cloth. Remay is the white fabric that will actually add heat. So it's really great in the spring and in the fall to cover things that you want to stay warm, but it's not shade cloth. It's not something that you can use to protect your crops from heat and wind. The main thing about gardening is planting and protecting. Once you've got your soil set up and your plants planted, it's, protecting it from weather conditions, protecting it from pests and predation and things like that. So we're going to move on now to the next slide and talk about what plants need. Wait a minute, we haven't finished climate challenges. Oh, right, okay. Drought in the growing season. So watering and retaining water on the land and getting water down to the root zone, it's really, really important. So, if you have rich soil with good organic content, that will hold water. If you place your plants according to their water requirements, and I know we have some questions about companion planting, and we'll talk a little bit more about companion planting when we talk about edible landscaping. But for example, you don't want something that really, really likes a lot of water, like tomatoes, with something that like beans, which is actually quite drought tolerant. And those kinds of considerations are really important as far as conserving water, but also making sure that everything gets at appropriate water. You can plant quite densely, because that will shade the soil and it will reduce evaporation. I know we had a question about square foot gardening, and one of the real great pieces of information from square foot gardening is how close you can plant things. If you keep your fertility up, you can actually plant things quite a bit closer than the seed packages recommend. And that's great, especially if you have a small space. And then finally, mulch deeply, because mulching protects the soil and it keeps it cool, and it really is important to hold the water in. We're in a constant race, because we garden in the drought, to make sure the water gets to the root zone. And I do go on quite a bit about trying to get water to the root zone. But let's talk now about what plants need. That will be the next slide. And this is all part of knowing limits and making sure that we are giving our plants the best opportunity to grow. So vegetables need about 6 to 8 hours of direct sun. They need morning sun and afternoon sun. They need nutrient-rich living soil. If you're filling raised beds with soil that you're buying, you're going to want to have some living compost, or you're going to want to get a mix of topsoil and compost. You're going to want some content of organic matter that can feed your soil microorganisms. Water to the root zone, that's really important. Water to the surface. And this is part of why you want a rain gauge, because when you look at your rain gauge and it says, oh, I only got 3 millimeters of water, you dig your trowel into the bed and you realize that it's not getting to the root zone, and you still do need to water. And then protection. Plants need protection from frost and wind and animals and insects, as I mentioned. And then photosynthesis, the next slide, is photosynthesis is how plants turn sunlight into food, right? So you need sun, you need carbon from the air, you need water from the soil, and you need micronutrients from the soil. Plants in the shade, which is the next slide, do not photosynthesize well. They really produce less food, they have less energy, they are weaker, they're more prone to disease and pests. You know, pests seem to just go for the weak plants. It's quite amazing. So you'll find that in the shade, the leaves are bigger and thinner, and the plants are weaker. So doing your best to make sure the plants get good sun is really the first step. So the next slide is also called photosynthesis. And this is what photosynthesis does. It produces the sugar, it produces the actual food, it produces the energy the plant needs for growth, it produces the sugar to store in the roots or the fruit. It also produces all the complex chemicals that are micronutrients, the starches, the oils, the proteins, all of that food that we want from the plants are produced by photosynthesis. The other thing that's really interesting is that about 40% of what plants produce is exuded into the root zone to feed the microorganisms in the soil. That's how important good soil is. The plants themselves are feeding the micronutrients in the soil. It's kind of amazing. They also need carbon dioxide from the air, and that means the leaf, if it's dry and it closes up those it's got little pores called stomata. If it closes those pores, it can't transpire, and photosynthesis stops. So in drought conditions, in hot, dry winds, you know, those little pores will close and photosynthesis stops, and then your plant starts wilting, and it's bad news. You know, if you're a flower gardener and you don't produce as many flowers as you normally do, or your plant is a bit weaker, it's not a big deal, but we're trying to feed ourselves. So we want to do the best we can for these plants because that's our food. And the less stress they have to deal with, the more food they can produce. So the limits on, I've lost my place, sorry. The limits on photosynthesis are, that'll be the next slide. The light, the quantity and the quality of the light, the temperature. Most plants won't grow, you know, below 10 degrees, even kale. You know, if the nights are cold and it doesn't get above 10 degrees during the day, it's not going to grow. The water, you know, if you go away from the weekend and things dry out, well, there's not going to be much production there. And again, it's got to be water at the root zone from the soil, not on the surface. And then carbon dioxide for transpiration is what draws the water evaporating from the leaves draws the water up through the roots, and the whole thing goes. So this is the next slide, is water and transpiration. That's the evaporation from leaves, draws water and micronutrients from the soil. That's what cools the plant. And then if it's hot, dry winds, transpiration is faster, and eventually those stomata will just close because there's not enough water available at the root zone to keep it going. And then you've got plants drooping and having drought stress, and at that point they'll bolt and go to seed, and it's bad news for the plant, and it's discouraging for the gardener. So in drought conditions, the stomata close to preserve the water, photosynthesis stops. And that's plants. That's what plants need. So really, for success, we want to give them as much as possible. So the next step then is assessing your site. That'll be the next slide. To try and choose the best spot. The most important thing is the sun. Where's the sun? If you can track the sun, see whether that block of shade from the neighbor's garage or your own garage is going to interfere with morning sun or evening sun. One of the things that's really good to do is to just sit, and now we have this stay-at-home thing, sit in the garden, and watch the sun every couple of hours. Make sure that you look around for all the places where there's sun and all the places where there's shade. The other consideration is, where is the water? If you're on city water, how far is the tap from the garden? Do you have a long enough hose? And then, are there low spots that might collect water, or might be frost pockets if you want to, you want to avoid those places where water sits and the cold air sinks, because that will also stress your plants and slow down their growth. The other thing is access from the house and the driveway, right? You're wanting to bring the food into the house with the minimum amount of work. If your garden is too far away, if you can, have to get out and walk. I mean, if your garden's 50 feet away, that's 100 feet to walk every time you go get something. Permaculturists, we're big on living in the garden and gardening all around as close as possible to the house. But also your driveway, because any kind of inputs that you're bringing in, whether it's a bag of soil or a tray of plants or anything like that, wherever you park, you have to then carry it over to the garden. The other consideration is it fenced? Certainly where we are with the deer, I'm in Comox, I know you're in Campbell River, but if it's not fenced, you really have a battle with the deer. So, and then one of the things as a new gardener, or when you're establishing new beds, to consider is, can you actually use the beds that are devoted to landscape? Can you plant into those landscape beds? So we're going to do a thing on edible landscaping, but if you can immediately get out there and plant a few radishes and some lettuce, you're going to have a harvest much quicker than if you have to wait until you can build a raised bed and get it filled with soil and then eventually plant. So don't discount a sunny flower bed as a place to maybe put a few vegetables as well. Okay, so next slide is designing for efficiencies. If you put the garden someplace that you normally walk past, I know we're all staying home, or we're supposed to be staying home, but when you think about getting out to your car or getting out to the street, if you're walking past on a daily basis and you can see what's happening on the garden, you're much further ahead in terms of reacting to anything like a drooping plant or a bug infestation. If you're there where you can see it every day, you will actually be more actively involved in taking care of it. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. I mean, I know that's really strong with me, but for most people, you have to be quite disciplined to, get home from work and, instead of flopping on the couch and eventually looking in the fridge, get out to wherever the garden is if it's not close. So planting along existing pathways, sidewalks, all of those places are prime spots. There may even be existing flower beds there. Certainly planting your herbs and your greens, anything that you're going to harvest on a daily basis or want on a daily basis, really close to your kitchen. And then your garden is there and you can run out while you're cooking supper to snip some herbs or you can run out in the morning while you're getting ready to cook an omelet and snip some herbs for it, right? It's a design efficiency to create a garden that you really will use, that you really will be eating from as much as possible. Okay, we're going to move on from that to establishing new beds. That's the next slide. Oh, right, design efficiency. We go back one, sorry, Lydia. That is planning your harvest and processing routine as, to keep as much soil and inedible biomass in the garden as possible, right? So if you can go out and harvest lettuce with a little bucket of water, dunk the lettuce in the water, get all the soil off, cut off all the leaves that are not going to be ones that you want to eat anyway, and come into the kitchen with a nice clean lettuce that's all food. You've left as much biomass in the garden as possible to feed the soil, microorganisms, and you've kept the dirt out. That's really important. The other thing to think about is your compost, because you want the compost to be convenient to both the kitchen and the garden. You don't want to spend your time hauling compost back and forth. Again, that just becomes work and it's really tedious. The other thing you can think about is if your compost is uphill from your garden, if nutrients are leaking from your compost, they're leaking towards your garden. So that's another consideration. You may not have slope, but it's worth thinking about. Really important to look at your site and spend a lot of time thinking about what you're going to do before you do it, because it's really easy to think through the mistakes and avoid them rather than actually having to change something you've done wrong. The other thing is build one bed and plant it before you're building a second bed. It does seem efficient that if you're going to do a garden, you build all your beds and then you plant all your beds, but it's only efficient if you don't consider how soon you're actually going to be eating. We're going to plant starting this week. We're going to plant probably every week until early July, and then we're going to plant every couple of weeks, July, August, September. Even if you get your one bed a month for the next 3 months, you're still going to have an opportunity to plant that bed. And if you take a month and a half to get all the beds in and then plant, you're not going to be eating as quickly. Okay, so let's talk about establishing new beds. That'll be the next slide. Thank you, Lydia. So tearing up your lawn is the last resort. It's a lot of work. You can rototill, that's noisy and unpleasant job, but you still end up with sods that will try to grow. That's actually a better alternative than tearing and removing the sod, because the grass is organic matter that will feed your soil. And the grass roots, that might be all the topsoil you have, right? So actually sod busting and removing sod is not a good idea if you can avoid it. It's a lot of hard work, and what do you do with the sod? You can pile it up and let it compost. It takes a long time to decompose, or you haul it away and then haul in soil. So it doesn't really make sense. If you can figure out a way to avoid getting rid of the sod, as I said, rototilling is a better option than taking the sod away. But there's also alternatives. The next slide is planting into the existing landscape and flower beds is what I mentioned. And flowers and vegetables grow very well together. Culinary herbs make fabulous landscape plants, and a lot of them are deer resistant. So if you're in a situation where you don't have fencing, culinary herbs are a really good choice. And then the other thing is to sheet mulch. And you can sheet mulch to kill the grass, or you can put cardboard sheet mulching down and then put a raised bed on top and fill the raised bed. That's the next slide, please, Lydia. You use waste biomass, which is cardboard, to suppress the grass and weeds, and it eventually turns into soil. So you're preserving your topsoil rather than getting rid of it. You're allowing the existing organic matter to decompose in place, so you're saving yourself a lot of work, reducing your back injuries, reducing the sore muscles. I mean, when you're young, and I've done a lot of sod busting in my life, when you're young and you recover quickly, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but eventually your back is not going to thank you for all that work. So the next slide, we talk about sheet mulching, how to sheet mulch. You can't use waxed or shiny or photo finished cardboard. That photo finished cardboard actually has a thin layer of plastic over it that will not biodegrade. You've got to try and remove as much of the plastic tape and the shipping labels and all those things as possible, because plastic is very, very bad for the soil microorganisms, just as it's bad for sea life in the ocean and things like that. Plastic is not good for the biosystem. So get your cardboard all prepared. You probably need about 3 times as much cardboard as you think. Cut down all the existing growth. So if you're sheet mulching lawn, mow it all down as short as you can. Add any of your soil amendments that you're planning to add, whether you have manure or compost or you want a lime or any of those things. Add that before you put the cardboard down. And then at this time of year, you're going to want to put soil on top of the cardboard, either in a raised bed or just piled up on the cardboard. In the fall, when you're preparing beds in the fall, you can actually just put leaves or mulch on top of the cardboard, and eventually in the spring when you want to plant it, it'll all be soil. So I usually cut a trench around the area that I want to sheet mulch so that I can tuck the edges of the cardboard in, because weeds and grasses will basically shoot out to the edge and then grow up around your cardboard. And then you know, if you could tuck it in, you can actually create an edge, and then place your raised beds or your soil on top, and you can actually just pile soil on top and plant directly into it. Or if you do raised beds are they're valuable in this in this part of the world because of the rain. They drain more easily, and they also warm up. The soil warms up more quickly in the spring. So raised beds are well worth considering, but they're not essential. Okay, so let's move on to making the most of what you have. You've done your evaluation of sun, water, wind, paying attention to wind, your soil, your space, and your time and energy. And we're going to just review each of these a little bit to be more specific about them. So that the first one is sun and shade. That's the next slide. Sun and shade. Most veggies, as I said, need 6 to 8 hours of sun. And the midday sun is very, very important. Plants can tolerate morning sun and afternoon shade more easily than they can tolerate morning shade and afternoon sun. And it's because the sun is cooler in the morning and it warms up gradually. Whereas if the plant is in shade all morning and then suddenly gets the blazing afternoon sun, that's really, really hard for the plant to take. Plants can also tolerate shade from trees and other plants. Dappled shade is easier than blocks of shade. So leafy greens are more shade tolerant. I've got a whole list of shade tolerant plants for you a little later on, I believe. And going on to sun and shade again, the next slide. I've already mentioned about sun mapping, actually paying attention to where the sun is and trying to figure out where the best spot for your heat loving and sun loving crops are. There's also possibilities in walls, like a south facing white painted wall is a great place for tomatoes and all those hot season crops. Sun traps, and I believe I have a picture of a sun trap on the next slide. Sun traps are rather like lining people up for a photograph. Basically all the tall people at the back and the shorter people kind of kneeling down in the front and making sure that everybody gets to see the camera, in this case the camera being the sun. So this is an image of a shrub garden with trees at the back, but this could easily be tomatoes or corn at the back or any of your tall crops, and then your front section for your low growing crops. The next slide is shade tolerant veggies. Now this, I believe, is reference from the BC Farm Food Network. I don't know if there's another slide that maybe has the reference, but we'll get that to you if you want it. So these are veggies that will be okay with 3 to 6 hours of sun or fairly constant dappled shade. So, you know, depending on your situation, don't give up on it just because you don't have the perfect sun conditions. There's lots of shade tolerant veggies. There's another slide of shade tolerant veggies. Next slide. So salad greens, you know, arugula, endive, anything that's the leaf you're eating doesn't need as much energy because it doesn't need to produce that stored energy in fruit or root or something like that. Broccoli, cauliflower, a little bit needs a bit more sun, but still fairly shade tolerant. Peas, beets, Brussels sprouts, radishes, pretty much all your leafy greens, and beans are also fairly shade tolerant. So something to keep in mind, if you don't have perfect sun, you can still choose veggies and produce some food for yourself. So that's sun and shade, and we're moving on to water now. And as I said, that'll be the next slide, Lydia, thank you. As I said, when you're evaluating your site, where is the water? If you're on city water, where is the tap? Do you have a hose that will reach? Do you need an irrigation system or a sprinkler? Do you have a backup system? Because one thing about irrigation systems is if they fail and you don't notice they fail, you know, you could be hauling water. And the important question is always, are you getting water to the root zone? And actually check. Set your watering system, let it go for however long you think is it. Get your trowel out and dig down beside your plants and see how deep the water has gone. One of the things that I do, which always surprises people, is if I'm overhead watering with a sprinkler, I try to do it on a cloudy or rainy day. When it's overcast, you don't get evaporation. So all of the water from that sprinkler gets to the soil and gets to your plants. Generally in the summer, our summer rains they don't penetrate. There's not enough water that actually comes, even if it's drizzly and cloudy. Get out there with your trowel and check how deep did that water go, right? When plants are watered always on the surface, their roots go up to the surface to try and catch that water, and then they're more susceptible to that little surface crust drying out, and they become less drought tolerant. So always check. And then the question is, how do you minimize the watering chore? How do you conserve water? That's the next slide. Conserving water. And this is from Gaia's Garden, which is a really great permaculture book for the Pacific Northwest for people in residential properties. And I think I have him on the reference list at the end. But certainly when we do the introduction to permaculture, I will be talking about Gaia's Garden a lot. So in permaculture, we're like, not how do we get water to the garden, but how many ways can we keep the soil moist, right? So high organic matter content in the soil, it acts like a sponge, and a deep mulch also acts like a sponge. It holds onto the water. Drought resistant plants, certainly I think there's a list of water loving and less water demanding plants. And if I don't have it in the slideshow, I'm sure you can find that on the internet. Dense plantings, I mentioned about the square foot gardening and how they talk about spacing your plants much closer than your seed packets will say. When plants are spaced close together, they themselves shade the soil, and there's much less water evaporation from the soil, and there's less opportunity for weeds, although they still will come up. There's less opportunity when you don't have a big 12-inch space between your rows. There's less opportunity for weeds, and there's less evaporation from the soil. And soil contouring, and that's another permaculture idea, but basically it is planting across the slope if there's a slope rather than down the slope, because if you're planting across the slope, your plants will actually hold the water from moving down the slope. So that's another way to conserve water. So our next slide is about soil. Oh, mulch, mulch, mulch. Okay, soil contouring and mulch. Mulching is really important. As I mentioned, bare soil in the winter just becomes compacted. In the summer, it just dries out. So mulching builds and preserves your precious topsoil. It reduces the labor because it suppresses weeds and it holds the moisture. It encourages fungi and other soil microorganisms and retains water. So it's a really good thing to do. And one of the problems with mulch is slugs, but slugs are actually pretty easy to deal with. You can buy slug bait, which is pretty affordable. I think the bag is, the small bags are $10 and the large bags are 15 or 20. It's really innocuous. It really just dries out the slugs. It doesn't damage the ecosystem or injure any of the predators on slugs. You can also use eggshell. I collect eggshell separately from my compost and crush it, and I will make like a little ring of prickly eggshell around my lettuce so that the slugs don't want to crawl over it. That sort of helps. I mean, discouraging slugs any way you can, but that's one of the downsides of high mulch is the slugs. Sometimes it's a problem depending on your site. If you've got a lot of shade, you're going to have more slugs. Anyway, let's move on to soil. And we did have several questions about soil. We've got an hour tonight, so I'm not really going to go into details about soil. Our next session next week, we're going to talk about soil, and we're going to talk about soil in detail, and I'm going to give you, some information about how to observe and test your soil and things like that. But so tonight, pretty cursory on soil. Generally, plants want about 12 inches of soil, 30 centimeters, or 18 inches is even better. So plants want soil depth for their roots. Soil isn't usually considered a limiting factor. Even if it's not good soil, it can be improved. Soil can always be improved. You don't need to buy soil unless you are sheet mulching and filling a raised bed. And if you are buying soil, buy the best quality. Like, make sure you get the compost mix. Buy the best quality soil you can, because it's usually the delivery cost in soil that's expensive, right? I mean, that I'm talking about if you're buying a volume of soil. Obviously, if you're buying just a couple of bags at the garden center or something, I mean, I would still say buy the best soil you can, because when you're importing nutrient, you want to import good nutrient that's going to work for you. And yeah, it's just not worth cheaping out on that if you're buying soil, but it's also not necessary. You can always improve your soil fertility, and that's the next slide. You can grow your own mulch. There's lots of plants like artichoke and mullein and comfrey and various big leafy plants that are quick growing that become mulch. You can also do crop rotation with your legumes, your peas and beans, or nitrogen fixing legumes. One of the things I mentioned about just leaving all the biomass that you're not going to eat in the garden, that's really important for organic matter in the soil. Plant to attract birds. There's a rule of thumb from ancient times about planting 3 times as much seed as you actually need, and some of it's for the birds and some of it's for the pests and some of it's for you. Add compost, make compost, add compost. Composting is really one of the best tools in the gardener's toolkit, and we will be talking about that when we talk about soils, and we may even add a specific class on compost if we get people interested. Use sheet mulching and practice no-dig methods. No-dig is really a good method of preserving your soil microorganisms. And when you think about plants putting 40% of the sugars they produce into feeding the soil microorganisms, you realize how important soil microorganisms are. So no-dig methods involve using a lot of mulch, trying to keep your soil loose and healthy and not having to dig. Obviously, you're going to dig if you've got a root crop like potatoes, you're going to dig to plant and you're going to dig to harvest. You may dig if you've got carrots, but you're not turning the soil all the time. You're not rototilling year after year. You're not, turning the soil and disturbing the soil microorganisms any more than you absolutely have to. Another method of composting actually is worm bins, vermiculture. That's a really great way to do kitchen compost, hot compost, I mean, high nitrogen compost, especially if you're in an apartment or if you're in a small space or if rats are a problem. Rats are often a problem on the coast here, and having rat-proof compost bins is hugely important. But the other thing you can do if you don't have a rat-proof compost is start a worm bin for your kitchen compost and just have your yard waste compost out in the garden. And worm castings and the liquid that comes off the worm castings is amazing fertilizer. So the last thing is soil probiotics. This is an aerated compost tea. We will be talking about that in more detail too, but basically you don't want your compost sitting in water stagnating and going anaerobic, because that will actually aggravate soil compaction and isn't really good. You've got to aerate it, or you know, get a bubbler or something like that. And that's a really useful thing to do, but that's more you know, more technical, more sophisticated. You know, for starting, really just getting to the point where you can make good compost is great, a great goal to have. Okay, so we've lost track of where I am. Improving soil fertility. There we go. So while we're talking about soil, one of the things you can do, especially if you're starting new, is look at your spot, look and see what is growing there now. Maybe it's turf, maybe it's just grass and there's not much information there. But if it's an old garden bed that you're renovating or something like that, the weeds that are growing there can actually tell you something. And the paying attention to how the water drains, that can tell you something. If it sits on the surface, if your soil is waterlogged, that's more difficult for your plants to manage, and you might want to consider raised beds. If it drains away too quickly, you might find that your soil is too dry and too sandy and doesn't have enough organic matter on it. So, you know, both of those are problems. Then the other thing is, what is the soil like? Is it gravelly or sandy? Is it slippery? Are there bits of organic matter in it? And digging into it, how deep can you dig before it changes? Because topsoil is quite different from subsoil. And if it changes in 2 or 3 inches, you know, that's not enough. For most plants want a lot more good soil than that. And building soil is sort of a constant for gardening. So always trying to build more soil. And then, are there worms in it? Are there critters in it? Is there any soil life that you can see? Because if you've got good, healthy soil life that you can see, it's likely that your microbiome, the soil life that you can't see, is also healthy. But if you don't find worms, you know, your soil might not be adequate, or it might need a lot of compost added. It might need a lot of work. So that's it for soil right now. I'm not going to go deeper into soil, but tune in next week and we'll talk in depth about soil. Let's move on to space. That's the next slide. And most of us don't have as much space as we want in our gardens. So, you know, every garden has microclimates, sunny spots, there's soil and drainage variations, which you're going to try and detect, and frost pockets and air circulation problems, which you're going to try and detect. You're going to try and find the best spots, but paying attention to where the best spots are is really important. And if you do have a small space, there's lots of things. That's the next slide. There's lots of things that you can do. Small scale intensive planting is actually much more productive in terms of how much food can be produced than large scale extensive planting. So in small spaces, you need to make sure you're getting more water, you're getting more nutrient, but you do get a lot more food. And small gardens are less work, simply because you're not walking as far, you're not hauling inputs as far, you're not hauling the harvest out as far, all of those things. So small scale intensive planting is a really good strategy. And I would encourage you, especially if you're new to gardening, to start a lot smaller than you think. Like, as I said earlier, plant that one bed. Start small and scale up slowly, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed and have too much space and just have garden become work that is endless. So that's a caution. And with the space you have, you can always go vertical. Lots of things like tomatoes vine and do well with supports, beans and peas vine and do well with supports. Things like cucumbers, melons, those kinds of things can be trellised. Lots of things will grow up if you don't have lots of room to grow out. You can also consider containers, pots, and hanging baskets. And then I keep saying edible landscaping because that is, a great way to make sure you're in the sun and you're getting the most food out. It's kind of a permaculture thing. I mean, permaculture is sort of edible landscaping writ large. Anyway, next slide is, this is interesting slide. The top left is the way my father used to garden. So every row of vegetables had, a footpath in between. And really, when you're gardening like that, about 50% of your land is path and 50% of it is productive land. Beneath that, in the lower left, is sort of the French intensive, where you do double rows, a double reach row, maybe 4-foot bed, and you can reach from both sides. And when you do that, you've upped your productive land considerably, because you've got one small path and then a nice wide bed that you can reach from both sides. So maybe you're to 75%. The image on the right is a keyhole bed, and it's essentially that double reach bed kind of curled around on itself, so that all the path is just a couple of steps in and a place to kneel down. And you still have the same space for, 2 or 3 or 4 rows, depending on what it is in there. But now you've got close to 90% of your space as productive space. You've really, really limited your paths. And if you go back, we won't go back, but you can look back at the slides. If you go back to the image of the sun trap, you'll see that this keyhole pattern is how the paths are done on that sun trap too. So it is possible to make it rectangular. So, in case you wanted to put a hoop house or use it in a greenhouse, it is possible to use the keyhole bed pathway system in a rectangular space. And give yourself a lot more productive land use than, minimize your path. So the next slides are images. Next slide, please. Images of a herb spiral. This is another permaculture technique where you basically take a long row and you curl it up on itself. You create a microclimate, a variety of microclimates, and that's really nice for herbs. A lot of our culinary herbs are Mediterranean herbs, and they want hot, dry conditions, right? So top of the herb spiral is hotter, drier, better drainage. Lower down, things that like more water, and in the back, things like sage that tolerate shade. Basically, it's a compact planting system, and if you do have rock or brick or something like that, it actually has quite a bit of thermal mass, so it heats up sooner in the spring and it keeps warm in the fall. The first herb spiral I ever did, I was quite blown away at how long my basil kept going, because basil is a very tender perennial in this tender annual in this climate. It does not like chilly weather, so this can be, if you have the resources, this can be a really good option. Next slide, please. The other thing is other ways of going vertical. I just, these are, the picture on the left is really neat because it's drain gutter from a roof and basically set up so that the water from the top drains down into the second one, drains down into the third one, drains down into the fourth one. Lots of options for going vertical. Next slide, please. I just love these pictures. I have this image of myself sitting with this herb and salad wall, sitting at a little cafe table with my tea and just kind of grazing on salad. Anyway, lots of opportunities to make creative use of small spaces. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're talking about what to grow, and this is my Venn diagram of what to grow. Choosing what to grow. The right stuff is in the middle. It's the stuff that grows well here and stuff that you like to eat. It doesn't matter how well things grow. If you don't like to eat them, don't grow them. It's a waste of time. It really is. If you don't love zucchini, don't grow zucchini. On the other hand, I love avocados, but they don't grow here, so that's not happening. When you're choosing what to plant, next slide, please. Think about, what are your favorite vegetables? What do you want to eat? What do you buy at the grocery store? What do you want to have on hand in order to make cooking interesting? You know, try to really focus in on things you know you will eat, and don't forget about, you know, perennials, herbs, and fruit. But you know, you don't have to focus exclusively on your annual vegetable garden, but you really, really want to focus on things that you know you will eat. Next slide, please. So now we're going into what is easy. The easiest crops: lettuce and salad greens, onions from onion sets. At this time of year, it's too late to plant onions from seed. So if you can still get onion sets, you can grow onions. Zucchini and summer squash, super easy to grow really quickly, really productive. If you don't love them, don't grow them. Beans and peas, it's getting late for peas. If you've got a cool or partial shady spot that you can keep the peas cool, that's a good thing to do. Beans won't, you know, you don't want to put beans in until the end of May probably. Potatoes, dead easy to grow, unless you have, if you're breaking up turf, you're likely to have click beetle and wireworm, because they like grass. That's where they prefer to lay their eggs, so your potatoes might not be successful. On the other hand, potatoes are a great way to break up compacted soil, so it might be a sacrifice crop. Your root vegetables, radish, beets, and turnips, pretty easy to grow. And most herbs are actually weeds. They grow really well under very poor conditions. So, you know, culinary herbs are a great place to start. And, you know, if you're doing container gardenings on the deck, they do well in containers. They do well with neglect. They do well with poor soil. The next slide is a bit more challenging crops. Carrots germinate really slowly, and they need warm soil. They need warm soil, and if the soil dries out, because they're teeny tiny seeds that are right on the surface, if the soil dries out, they die. So carrots are a little bit of a challenge. Cauliflower is a bit of a princess, very sensitive to heat, cold, you know, uneven watering. Cauliflower doesn't do well. Leeks and onions from seed. I mean, next year you can start onions from seed in February and plant out little tiny onions. This year it's too late for that. Celery, celeriac, yeah, all of those have to be started indoors in February, so forget that for now. Your perennial vegetables, which I really would encourage you to consider: asparagus, rhubarb, artichoke, lovage. Artichoke's difficult because it does not like to sit in water over the winter. So with our torrential rains, it's sort of, unless you can put it on a berm or something like that, artichokes not so much. But I've had really good results with asparagus, and rhubarb is lovely. Anything, you know, that fills that sort of spring hunger gap is well worth considering. More challenging, next slide, is things, our favorites: tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, cucumbers, melons, and winter squash, and then corn. All of these things need to be started indoors. Tomatoes, you start mid-March, peppers and eggplant shortly after that. I'm starting cucumbers and melons. I started them last week. You could probably still start them indoors. Winter squash, you could probably still start indoors. All of those things need to be started before the gardening season, because they have such a long growing season, or because they're very sensitive to our cold, overcast summers when we have them like that. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. What to plant. So, you know, we've figured out what you like to eat, and you've chosen the kinds of things. Plant more than one variety of each crop. See if you can buy seeds or get plants and share with your neighbors. Try to plant 2 or 3 different varieties, because each variety is going to be slightly different taste. You don't know which is your favorite, but they also going to be slightly different response to weather conditions. So you may find that one variety does really, really well for you in a hot, dry year, but the other variety does a better job in a cool, overcast year. And if you have 2 or 3 varieties, then you sort of have insurance, a little bit of crop insurance. Look for locally produced seed and bedding plants. The farmers market is a great place to get advice, growing information, seed, bedding plants. I mean, farmers are amazing. They are happy to help you and encourage you and give you tips. Also, your neighbors, if you, especially if you have, you know, neighbors who have been in the neighborhood and have been gardening for years and years, they are invaluable, especially because you don't have good weather records yet. They probably do know, you know, that when is a good time to do what. So talk to your neighbors. The other reason you want to talk to your neighbors is because they maybe have room for more stuff or more interesting stuff, or they may be growing more difficult stuff that you can grow, and you can sometimes trade. Most people who garden are happy to share their abundance with you. So next slide, please. Okay, this is about extending the harvest. If you plant all your potatoes as late season potatoes, you don't get to start eating until late in the season. But if you plant early, late, and mid-season varieties, you can extend your harvest for longer. Plants that have a very long harvest period, for example, chard you can plant in the spring and you can keep it going in the garden into December. That's, you know, you can be eating for the longest possible time. Short season or early varieties of the heat lovers, because weather is unpredictable, if you can get the short season stuff going, you have a better chance of getting a crop before the rains come and ruin them. The next slide is about crop rotation. So I don't know how we're doing for time, but we've got a bit more. Crop rotation, there's several reasons for crop rotation. Fertility is the least reason for a gardener, because you can always add compost and improve the soil. You know, on a small scale, that's pretty easy to do. If you're farming, of course, crop rotation for fertility is much more important. Having said that, I do like to do a rotation that includes legumes because they're nitrogen fixers. But the main reasons that we do crop rotation is for disease control and pest control. And there are 2 particular diseases that are problematic in this part of the world. So the next slide is plant families to rotate. The alliums, the garlic, onions, chives, shallots, leeks, all of those. There's a disease called white rot. The brassicas, your kale, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, turnips, radishes, all of that. There's a soil disease called clubroot. And then the carrot family, the carrot, celery, parsley, parsnips, all of that, cilantro, dill. There is a pest, a carrot rust fly. So the next slide, I think, has a picture of white rot. It's really an interesting name because it's exactly descriptive of what it looks like. Once you have white rot in your soil, that's it. 25 years before you can grow alliums again. So if you can do a 4-year rotation for alliums, it's really important that you do it. If you can only do a 3-year rotation, do a 3-year rotation. If you can only do a 2-year rotation, you know, do the best you can. Crop rotation is kind of like running with scissors. You never know if you're will have a problem, but don't set yourself up. It's like cutting towards yourself, you know, or you know, you just don't do it. You may you may not have a problem, but why set yourself up? So the next slide shows the brassica, the cabbage clubroot. Again, this is like a more than 25-year problem. If you've got clubroot, you don't get to grow anything in that family for 30 years. So again, if you can do a 4-year rotation, that's really, really important. And if you can't, do a 3-year rotation or a 2-year rotation. Do the best rotation you can, because these diseases just do not go away. The next slide is the carrot and parsley family, and this is an insect pest. So the carrot rust fly finds carrots, the carrot family, by smell. It's got, you know, a few weeks life cycle, so the population increases over the season. So you can plant your spring carrots in a place where your winter carrots have been, but you cannot follow your spring carrots with summer carrots without problems. You can use floating row cover, remay, or whatever when you plant your carrot seeds. cover them, you know, and make sure it's tight so that the carrot rust fly can't get in. Unfortunately, if there's carrot rust fly there already, you probably just trapped it in with your carrots. You can also interplant very strong smelling herbs with your carrots. That's often recommended. It's basically to mask the smell so that carrot rust fly can't find your carrots. You can also top dress with spent coffee grounds. Again, you're masking the smell. So what I do is I save my coffee grounds separately, and I go out and I do a side dressing of coffee grounds every few days when I've got a full tub along the carrots, and basically trying to confuse the carrot rust fly. Okay, next slide is tomatoes, and there is a plant disease for tomatoes, I think, tomato blight. Unfortunately, blights it's a fungal thing, and if you have the conditions for blight, you'll get blight. The one thing is, don't plant tomatoes on a bed that's had potatoes, because potatoes also same family and they carry the blight. I don't know about Campbell River, but in this in Comox, the blight is in the soil. So, you know, if you have the conditions for blight, you're going to have blight. Having said that, tomatoes actually can be grown in the same spot year after year if you maintain your fertility and you keep the fertility up. That's actually good news, because generally in a small garden you only have 1 or 2 spots that have really good light, really good sun for tomatoes. So tomatoes, it's really a matter of keeping them dry. If the leaves are wet and they don't dry out within the 10 hours or something like that, you end up with blight conditions. So you know, again, we're not watering the leaves, we're watering the soil and trying to get the soil to the root zone of the crops, regardless of what it is, but particularly not water on the leaves of tomatoes. So I never use overhead watering on tomatoes. And of course, you know, that was my point about the early season, short season tomatoes, is you want to make sure you get the bulk of your crop off before the fall rains come, because you're likely to get blight if you don't have good coverage. Okay, so the next slide is actually talking about kin planting. Kin planting is planting all the same family in one bed. So you never want more than 1/4 of your garden, if you're doing a 4-year rotation. You never want more than 1/4 of your garden to be onion. You plant all your onion, leeks, shallots, scallions, all in one bed. You plant the whole, you know, all the cabbage family that you want, you plant it all together in one bed. And then your simple crop rotation is brassicas, root crops, alliums, legumes, and you just do the 4 years. So it's important that you keep your perennials separate. Like if you have chives, you want them in a perennial bed, not in your crop rotation bed. So if you have chives, or if you're letting kale self-seed, don't let it self-seed in the garden, let it self-seed in a perennial bed. the next slide, please. Okay, we're almost done. I'm not sure about the time, but we're almost ready for questions. A couple of things. You don't need to rotate lettuce, so that's a good companion plant for brassicas for sure. You don't need to rotate the beet, chard, and spinach. You don't need to rotate any of the cucumber, squash, or melon family. And then you're rotating the legumes because of for fertility. And corn, of course, is the only really grass that we grow as a garden crop, so it doesn't need to be rotated either. The next slide is about you, and I put this as a little bit of a joke, Dress for Success, gardener version. It's really important as far as keeping yourself healthy, you know, to actually dress appropriately in the garden, especially if you're digging, you know, wear hard-soled shoes for digging, wear socks and shoes in the garden when you're working in the garden. Bright colors and floral prints and things, scents, they all attract bugs, they all attract insects. So, you know, if those are your kind of clothes that you want to wear, you wear them when you're not gardening. Loose clothes are always easier and cooler, easier to work in and cooler than form-fitting clothes. And then gloves and pockets. Pockets are very useful. So that's the dress for success. And the next slide is our sum up, which is, so plant in the sun, make sure you get the water to the root zone, keep it manageable, start small and stay close, grow local varieties of the food that you actually want to eat. Try to maintain some habitat for your beneficial insects and pollinators, build up your soil, and keep your records. And then the final slide that I have is resources. At the very bottom, you'll see my email address, and that is, so if you can contact me if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions. The other resources, Linda Gilkinson, who's on Salt Spring, is brilliant. Her books are fabulous. They're written for this part of the world. That's one of the most important things about gardening books, is that they actually apply to the part of the world that you're gardening in. She's a bit farther south, so of course, you know, you have to take that into account. She has a blog that is well worth following. Very, very useful. She puts out once a month what to do in the garden, and then if you're on her blog, you can go to all her archives that gives detailed instructions on all kinds of things. Very, very useful. The Carolyn Harriet, the 0 Mile Diet, also local. She's in Saanich, again, a bit farther south, but she's also written a book called The Year-Round Garden. No, A Year on the Garden Path. Again, very useful for people in our part of the world because it's the same bioregion, the same ecosystem. Carol Depp is even farther south. Her books are very good as well. She's in the Willamette Valley, so she's still Cascadia, she's still in the Pacific Northwest, but you have to be really careful about her planting dates because they may not apply to us. And then she also has a website. So there's one other author I didn't get on the list, Steve Solomon. He's also in the Willamette Valley. He's got some excellent books on gardening. He's much more conventional, even though it's organic. It's very conventional, not permaculture, but he's also got some excellent books. Really, the most important thing for gardening resources, websites, you name it, is where is this written? Because you'll find things that say, now is the best time to plant your winter gardens, and you think, really? And then you find out it's in Georgia, you know, so that's not very useful. Anyway, that's what I have. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm turning it back over to Lydia so that we can do a bit of Q&A.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was an amazing workshop. I learned so much. Thank you. So basically, the questions that we got ahead of time were nearly all really focusing on soil and on compost, seaweed use, and then small places and container planting and companion planting. So I think that most of those questions that haven't been answered today will definitely find an answer in our upcoming workshops. And yeah, as I said initially, our next one is already going to take place next week, Tuesday evening, same place, I wanted to say, yeah, Zoom. That's easy these days. And at the same time. So I have two questions here for you, as I know we're short in time, but there is a nice question here that came in from Holly tonight. And Holly is a first-time gardener, and she has like a 8x4 raised bed, and she says she has premium topsoil for veggies and 5 to 6 hours of sun.
Yay.
She's leaning what mixed brassicas with zucchini and a range of greens and herbs and tomatoes. And Holly is wondering if she can plant them in the topsoil as is, or if she indeed needs to mix in any amendments.
I think you can just plant right into it, Holly. I think you can always add mulch, and you can add amendments on top, and your soil microorganisms will actually come up and snag those nutrients and bring them deeper. So I think you can go ahead and plant, and, you know, make sure that you keep adding nutrient. One of the things about raised beds and containers is that nutrients do sort of drain through. So whatever you can do to add nutrient, you know, that was the answer to the question about seaweed. Is yes, seaweed is great. You can use it as top dressing as long as it doesn't touch your plants. You know, any organic matter that you can add to your soil, it isn't going to either burn because it's too hot, like kitchen compost that hasn't been composted yet, or draw too much nitrogen, like straw is great. Just keep on adding that compost and adding that organic matter to the top. So plant into the soil you have and keep on adding nutrients.
Mm-hmm. And Elaine, another question that Holly has asked is what she can and what she can't plant together from her list. She mentioned zucchini and then a range of greens and herbs and tomatoes. Is there anything that wouldn't go well together?
She might find that the tomatoes need a lot more water than the herbs. And certainly you're going to want to plant the tall stuff sort of on the north side to make sure that they don't shade out your other things. So herbs, depending on what herbs you're looking at, a lot of herbs like sort of hot, dry conditions, like rosemary and oregano and things like that, prefer hot, dry conditions. Other herbs go great, like basil goes great with tomatoes. Basil and peppers and tomatoes go fabulously together. Really, I think the big consideration is, you know, what does the water requirement look like for those plants, and then where are the roots? Because if the roots are in the same zone of the soil, if you think about, you know, a cutaway of the soil underground, for example, blueberries and strawberries both have shallow roots, right? So they don't do well as a companion. If you can put something like parsley, which has a deep taproot with a blueberry or with strawberries, you've got a better combination. So think about where the roots of that plant are going to go and make sure you space them properly. But those are the two main considerations. There's lots of information about companion planting, so you can always look up specific combinations that are good.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Elaine. Here's a quick question that came in from Blair. She says, by the way, that she loved your presentation.
Thank you.
Outstanding, she says. And yeah, so her question is, if you have a recommendation regarding tomato plants that go really well in our area. I think she's in the valley.
I would I would recommend that you talk to your farmer's market. They're selling tomato starts, and you can tell them, you know, what your favorite tomatoes are like, and they will make a recommendation. There's quite a wide range of possibilities that do well on the coast. The biggest thing about tomatoes is that if you have something that is, you know, doesn't really develop its crop until late in the season, the chances are that you could lose it to the rain. But that's a question for the people who are selling starts at your farmer's market. Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Elaine. Sherry asked, again, for the name of the author of A Year on the Garden Path.
Okay, that's Carolyn Harriet. I noticed this last slide is sort of messed up. So we've got Linda Gilkinson's website and then Carolyn Harriet's name beside it. Carolyn Harriet, The 0 Mile Diet, and A Year on the Garden Path. She's in Saanich.
That was probably me converting.
No, it's just the conversion, file conversion does stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. There comes a lot of thank yous.
Thank you.
So many thank yous. Oh my God, I don't remember. I'll just go back to the questions that I have because we have 4 minutes left. We can as well use them. I had a nice question that came in regarding a lasagna garden, and that was before we ran this class.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That came in from Kath. I don't know if Kath is joining us tonight, but she's gardening with her 11-year-old neighbor. That's a fun thing to do. So it's their common project, and they have put down horse manure and cardboard, grass, leaves, seaweed, and composted grass, and all that has turned into dirt. So
Well, language. We don't use those words. It's soil. Sorry. It's one of my garden teachers. We never hack or whack, and I can't remember the other one. Anyway, never mind.
Okay, so the soil is only 1 to 2 inches deep, she says, and she was thinking about starting lettuce. And the neighbor's girl, she wants to start cherry tomatoes. So if she would, if Kath would go ahead and start the tomatoes indoors, how should she go about the planting? She's wondering, should she make little hills of soil to plant in?
She could definitely do that. It is a bit late to be starting tomatoes. I usually start tomatoes about the middle of March, so I would recommend that she go pick up some tomatoes from the farmer's market. It's going to give her the best chance of actually getting a crop. She can hill up the soil around the tomatoes. She could also cut a little kind of X in the cardboard and just peel back the flaps and plant the tomato deeper in. If there's still uncomposted biomass in there, that might not be the best choice, but certainly hilling up the soil around the tomatoes would be fine.
Okay. Do you have any other suggestions for things that those two could plant? Besides plant what they like to eat?
Well, yes, really, plant what you like to eat. Certainly the plants will, you know, want more water and more nutrient until the cardboard breaks down. So probably giving it a bit more space than they normally would is a good idea. And building up the mulch around the plants is a good idea. Certainly leafy greens like lettuce and salad crops are the best because you know, the mass of the plant and the mass of the root are a bit more balanced for a shallow planting. They're not going to be doing any root crops likely, and they don't want to probably do anything really, really large like brassicas, because they need quite a bit of root room to balance the mass above the ground.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Elaine. We're getting very close to 8 o'clock here, and I want to let people, and especially you, get back to a rest area. Myself. So we have one last question. That's a quick one. Where is the best place to plant cilantro? In the herb garden, raised bed, or container? That's a question from Darla.
Cilantro will be fine in all of those locations. Cilantro self-seeds quite readily, so I try to keep it away from the annual rotation beds because it's part of the carrot family. I don't want cilantro growing in some place that is going to, you know, attract the carrot rust fly. I like to keep it in a perennial bed. It does really well in containers. It doesn't transplant well. It will bolt if you try to transplant, but it grows really well from seed. And you can let it go to seed in a perennial bed, and you will have cilantro in the spring early. Cilantro also doesn't do well in the heat of summer, so you can plant it now. It may bolt, but you probably want to replant later in the season, you know, maybe even in August, and you will have a really good fall crop.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Elaine. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining, and especially you, Elaine. It's been super, super informative. I think we all learned very, very much, and we were actually very, very many people, which is amazing. So I'm looking forward to all our next sessions, and we will be promoting those on Facebook. I think that is the best place for now, and on our website, on the Greenways website. And all the other questions that I see here that came in the chat are basically regarding soil and compost. So that will definitely be discussed in depth next week. And yeah, a huge thank you to everybody for joining us on this first
thank you
journey. And yeah, I hope to have everybody online again next week on Tuesday evening. And
thank you, Lydia.
Yeah, I will end this meeting now, and wish everybody a fantastic evening. Thank you so much. Elaine, you were great. Thanks.
Thank you, Lydia. Bye.
Bye-bye.